All right, what's up, everybody? Happy Thursday evening. Thank you for being down to spend it with us. We're part of that. My name is Keegan. Here, on behalf of the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition as well as Red Ant Collective. Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition exists to help spread anti-imperialist political education as well as build support for movement against the many wars the United States is involved in. And the Red Ant Collective is a group in Albuquerque, a socialist group that's studying as well as helping to build a working class movement for dignity in New Mexico and the United States as a whole. I'm joining y'all from New Mexico. Awesome, yeah. I am also very grateful to be here. Also grateful that our comrade Kobe is helping us with tech, holding it down. So thank you very much, Kobe. But yeah, let's get started. Let's move to the next slide. The reason that we're here is that, momentous events have happened in the Middle East sort of in the past 2 decades, right? But the most recent of which is the overthrow of the Syrian government. This is not disconnected from the conversation that has been happening around Palestine. So we want to acknowledge is a really terrible word because it feels like it doesn't have enough weight, but this is day 440 of the genocide that has been happening by Israel in Gaza with the complete support, funding, arming of the United States. This is 45,000 people killed, plus people killed in the official count, which is likely an enormous undercount. There are other reliable sort of projections that put the number well into the hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed, both from the kinetic warfare as well from the costs of siege, starvation, rampant spread of disease, etc. It's also important to note the resistance in Gaza, the many militant factions that resist, genocide and colonialism are still fighting. And our friends that, well, I mean, I wish they were our friends. The people that we look up to, analysis that we read at the Electronic Intifada every week are showing us the ways in which they're still resisting, which is really powerful. Cool, next slide, please. So the agenda for this evening is that we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say imperialism. So I think that really matters when we're analyzing the events that have unfolded in Syria. Moon is going to give us some details on Syrian history before significant US intervention. And then we're both going to talk about the details of the US intervention itself, which is myriad. There are many ways that the US helped destabilize a sovereign country. And we're going to talk a little bit about what actually happened in early December to now, as well as kind of like what that means for the region, for Palestine, et cetera. And then we're going to open it up to questions and discussion. A note on that is that Kobe is watching the chat, so if anyone has questions or comments, like please use the chat as we go through the presentation. Yeah, we'd really welcome that. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the goals for this are rooted in two things. One is that, the Palestinian movement in the United States is pretty fractured by this conversation. And it has been, I think, difficult to see a lot of people really celebrating. I think what we're arguing is the destruction of a sovereign state. And so that's one point is just the context of what happened and how the US played a fundamental role. And that's the second point, is understanding how the US played a role in making that happen. Awesome. I mean, not awesome, but next, please. Yeah, next slide. So we're going to open it up first with just an open-ended question. We'll give a minute or two for folks to either in the chat or come off mute and say what comes to mind when you think of imperialism. Yeah, use the chat, come off mute. Like I said, we'll give ourselves a minute or two to do some collective brainstorming. Awesome. We have land theft in the chat. The US with tentacles everywhere. Someone says, still around? Like, this is still happening? Other things that come to mind when we think of imperialism. Self-destructive behavior. Curious if you wanted to elaborate on that. I totally agree. But yeah, that's, yeah, curious. Quote, quote unquote democracy. The extraction of labor and natural resources. The tentacles image will be relevant when you see the graphic that we found. Anything else anyone want to throw in the chat or come off mute before we move on? And thank you for those who bravely typed into the chat in a internet room filled with strangers. Tightening the domestic class contradictions to the point of monopoly and state alliances occupying or destabilizing sovereign territories for profits. Very well said, Dylan. And that is extremely relevant to the conversation we'll be having tonight. So like we mentioned, please use the chat as we go through the presentation, and then we'll have time for us to talk at the end. But don't be shy. Let's go to the next slide. All right, there's tentacles. Actually, this happens to be centered around England, but it's a good image. So when we say imperialism, we are using Vladimir Lenin as kind of the keystone, although not the only person to influence what we're saying. But we're talking about a development of capitalism, a stage of capitalism. And so to talk about that, I just want to mention that a capitalist system is always looking for labor, for raw materials and land, and for markets to sell the products that it's manufacturing. Early on, that might have looked like, in England, for example, it looked like taking over common spaces that were held by English peasants to either log them for timber, or you raise the timber down and build factories. And then it also looked like enslaving, millions of people all over the world, predominantly in Africa, for a slave trade. Now it looks a little bit more insidious, and we'll get into how that looks in the next slide. So as we said, this is another strategy to essentially for capitalism, which has to keep growing for it to remain essentially solvent, to continue itself. So imperialism is inseparable from the rise of banking, the amount of power that banks and global financial systems now have over all of our lives, and this gives imperialists a wider range of tools to use to secure land, resources, labor, markets, etc. And importantly, these tools are not, a lot of them are not straight up military strength. They're not straight up bombing, invasion, etc. And so many of us have been socialized to believe that a lot of these tools are humane. When you hear, for example, the word sanctions, I don't, certainly before I understood more about them, I didn't know much about what that meant, other than it was some kind of economic thing where we didn't allow someone to buy something from us. I didn't have good context for it, and it doesn't sound particularly evil. And maybe I'm silly, but I think many of the tools that we'll talk about, we don't understand the sort of devastating impacts that they have because they have somewhat benign names and they're not explicitly associated with military strength. Next slide, please. So the tools that imperialism and imperialists have Again, alongside the threat of military force is absolutely um, a part of this, but so are sanctions, which are unilateral coercive measures that countries like the United States and many European countries use to force other um, countries to do their bidding with economic coercion. Um, this could look like debt to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which gives the countries that control the IMF and the World Bank, which is the United States and the West more generally, enormous leverage over the internal political systems of countries that have debt to those organizations. In order to, for example, receive money from the IMF or the World Bank, countries have to go through what are called structural adjustment programs, which liberalize their economies and which have caused many countries across the world that had sovereign assets, that had public things that were owned by their people, to get sold for the benefit of Western capitalist interests. This also looks like funding opposition. So USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy are both, they sound good. I think that's the United States Agency for International Development and the National Endowment for Democracy are both arms of soft power that the United States uses to fund nonprofit groups and other organizations in countries where they're sowing dissent against a government that the United States doesn't like. This also looks like diplomatic and political coercion through those soft power arms, through wrangling at the United Nations. And also looks like proxy war. It looks like using other countries or other combatants, not necessarily part of a state, to fight against countries that you don't want, and that the US doesn't want to be in power. So again, a number of these things are not explicit kinetic warfare, but their impact can be just as bad as kinetic warfare. Next slide, please. So one of the primary functions that imperialism serves is to force dependency of countries on the Western, on the US and the West. If you're a country that has its own manufacturing system, you don't have to buy things from the West, and that's a problem for the companies here that need to sell all their excess product. So that's one of the primary things that it does, is it forces a number of countries out of sovereignty, out of independence and self-sufficiency, to being dependent on the Western system. Currently, I think this is as of 2022, 1/3 of the world is under US economic sanctions. The US sanctions many people, but also so does the EU, and this does not account for that. This is simply talking about sanctions from the United States. Ongoing war in many failed states ruined by economic proxy and direct warfare, like Libya, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, countries that are war-torn from interventions the United States and other Western countries have undertaken. And states all over the world are prevented from self-determination and sovereignty. So again, wanted to just do a very brief, there's so much more to say about what imperialism is, but we just wanted to give a brief primer on what we mean when we talk about it. So we'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Luna.
Yeah, and I think that just as a reminder, or like I guess where I'm coming from is like the idea of world news. When world news happens and these horrific events happen, or just any event that involves a lot of people getting killed and governments shifting, being in the U.S., it's important to keep in mind our position, which is the purpose of this whole presentation, is looking at things from a U.S. perspective, and the U.S. role in everything. So that's why the discussion around imperialism and this discussion around sanctions, which we'll go into in a second. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about the history of Syria before the U.S. even became a country. It is part of the Fertile Crescent, a crescent-shaped region in West Asia and North Africa, which includes parts of modern-day Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine. And because it's part of this crescent region, it's considered part of the cradle of civilization. one of the oldest places on Earth. So on the left, we have this what's considered the oldest church on Earth, the Church of Saint Simon's Stylites near Aleppo, and then on the right, one of the oldest and largest castles, which is also in Syria. Um, and yeah, Syria also had really ancient libraries and religious centers. And so it had this whole civilization full of different people before the U.S. even became a place. And um, it's very diverse. So there's a lot of different ethnic and religious groups, including Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Druze, Palestinians. There's Sunnis, Shias, Christians, and it was colonized from 1919 to 1946 by France. Gained its independence from France in the 40s in 46, and then the decades after that, there were a lot of different governments and movements happening across West Asia, and Syria was one of the places where some of the more radical formulations of these movements were happening, which is why we continue to see the blowback today that we're seeing from the US. So in particular, in the 60s up to 1970, Syria was a space for resistance factions, Palestinian and other Arab factions, and Marxists and Islamists. And the Ba'ath Party, which is a socialist group, carried out what's described as a fusion of nationalism and Marxism in Syria.
Also, go ahead, Lynn, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that context. I think the other highlights that we wanted to note before we dive into some of the more specifics about the current, the things that led up to the current moment, and the reason we chose 2011 here is because 2011 is the year that the United States really ramped up its intervention and regime change efforts within Syria. Syria had been self-sufficient in food production for decades. It's one of the few countries in the Middle East that does not have to import much of its own food because it has a very thriving wheat industry, or it had, I should say, a very thriving wheat industry. It was able to provide free healthcare to all of its people. It provided free primary education to its people. It had a very strong pharmaceutical industry and just a fairly well-developed economy generally, especially for the region. As of 2010, it had no foreign debt, and this is really noteworthy. As we mentioned, foreign debt is one of the primary means of leverage that the United States and the Western system uses to influence people's internal affairs, and it had none at all. And so that point of leverage, which is used, over many countries of the world over, was not accessible in Syria. And kind of going back to why we are arguing that this is very related to the Palestinian movement, the movement for Palestinian liberation, is that Syria provided a political safe space for Palestinian resistance factions to meet, to train, to meet with other anti-Zionist entities across the region, which was rare. Jordan is not a safe space for that, as are many other Arab countries that have been kind of enveloped by the Western system. And so we'll talk more about this point later, but this is a very, very important point that Syria was actually a very important linchpin in the region's support for Palestine as a whole. Next slide, please. All right, so unfortunately, in the chat, Dylan says 1949 also saw the first CIA-backed coup since its inception in 1947, outing President al-Kuwatli. Thanks, Dylan. So that just demonstrates that regime change efforts in this region and in Syria in particular have been going on for literally decades by the United States, which is related to the point that we want to make here, which is that for countries that fall outside of the Western system, the US's foreign policy essentially amounts to regime change. That can take many different forms. Many of those forms happened in Syria, but we want to highlight a memo that was published in 1960 about Cuba. So the Cuban government The Cuban people overthrew the Batista government, which is a dictatorship backed by the United States, a very brutal dictatorship. Um, and immediately, the US was not happy about this. And so, because they knew that the Cuban people actually supported the Castro government, they said the following in this memo, and I just want to quote this, which is that I'm paraphrasing this, we want to create a policy, and now I'm directly quoting, that makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. I want to read that last bit a second. I'm sorry, I want to read that last bit again. We want to enact policies to now, I quote, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. That line can be copy pasted into dozens of US regime change efforts to target a civilian population, make it immiserated in a variety of different ways so that it wants to overthrow its own government. That doesn't mean that no one ever, wants to overthrow a government without US intervention. But the point is that in this case, in Cuba's case, and as we'll discuss in Syria's case, enormous amounts of money was spent, enormous amounts of blood was shed, enormous amounts of arms and weapons were pumped into a country to completely destabilize it and to make the lives of the people who live there completely miserable with the goal of changing the government of that country. Next slide, please. It's also important to note that in the same way that regime change is a through line in U.S. foreign policy for countries that it doesn't get along with or doesn't see eye to eye with, Syria, as Dylan kind of demonstrated in the chat, has been in the crosshairs of the U.S. and in the crosshairs of Israel since Israel's inception. So in the weeks after 9/11, the Pentagon started to discuss that it wanted to have 7 wars in 5 years. The countries that it wanted those wars in to change their governments were Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Libya, Sudan, and Somalia. Every single nation on this list, it didn't happen in 5 years, but in the last 24 years, every nation but Iran has been racked by war in US-supported efforts, which is like just disgusting. But they're moving this policy along. General Wesley Clark admitted this. This is widely known that these countries, these sovereign countries, were all targeted for regime change. In some ways for decades, but very specifically after 9. All right, next slide, please. So let's finally get to the meat of this. In Syria, the US used many of its tools that we mentioned earlier. It used a program or an architecture, as described by the wild people who actually make this happen, a program of escalating sanctions that ratcheted down the pressure, called maximum pressure campaigns, to destroy Syria's economy, basically, rapidly inflate its currency, etc. It used a proxy war where it equipped via a CIA operation called Operation Timber Sycamore to fund Al-Qaeda and other Sunni supremacist Islamic extremist-dominated insurgency as an anti-state force against Syria. Since 2014, the United States has occupied, in collaboration with local militia, an entire third of Syria's landmass, where its primary wheat and oil fields are. It has manufactured consent for the destruction of the Syrian government by demonizing the government itself, as well as by rebranding Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations that were leading among the most powerful of these insurgencies and that are now sitting as the de facto rulers of Syria, as well as a bombing campaign of years by Israel, hundreds of bombing runs over many years by Israel, and more recently added to by the United States.
Cool. Well, all right, I'm going to talk about sanctions. So first, I just want to say it's very difficult for us in the West to even be able to fathom the extent by which sanctions destroy lives across the globe. And I also want to root this back into the Palestinian resistance struggle, because a lot of the sanctions are justified by manufacturing consent, with the US claiming that Syria is a terrorist organization. And a lot of these terrorism charges come from Syria's collaboration with Hezbollah, and the alliance with Iran, specifically to help Hezbollah and Hamas and other militant factions that are trying to decolonize their land. So 1979, they labeled Syria. The U.S. State Department labeled Syria a terrorist. Let me see this. I think it's terrorist, state sponsor of terrorism. This is also the label that they call Cuba. They're trying to charge Luigi Mangione with the same thing. But yeah, state sponsor of terrorism. Like we've mentioned this at other events before, but terrorism doesn't have a legal definition, so it's really just like a subjective word. But that was the primary reason for introducing sanctions in '79. They ramped up again in 2004, 2011, 2020, and then bans on sanctions are essentially banning all U.S. goods, European goods as well, except for food and medicine, but also probably food and medicine, banning import of trade of Syrian energy, preventing investment in Syria and affected third parties, countries as well after 2020. And then Keegan says Hezbollah is a political organization in Lebanon whose military wing has fought Israeli occupation and invasion of Lebanon, as well as fought Israel in support of Palestine. So we have a list of resources, and I put one of the resources was the International People's Tribunal, which I encourage everyone to read. It's a group of lawyers and scholars and organizers from across the world that really just documented the effect of sanctions. And one of the countries that they documented was Syria. So the top quote from some of their findings was that Syria threatened the U.S. geopolitical dominance in West Asia. West Asia is a word that other people call Middle East, such as oil producing countries of Iraq, Iran, and Syria. So it's about geopolitical dominance. And then the bottom quote says that the United Nations found that the most recent round of U.S. sanctions could constitute inhumane and degrading treatment. So essentially saying that these the U.S. sanctions against Syria were essentially torturing the people of Syria. And again, it's really difficult for us to fathom because it's just economic laws, and we don't see how they impact people's lives, but they do impact every aspect of life. So the sanctions impact how much food people are able to get. Sanctions impact not only banks but other financial institutions, like whether or not I can get money wired to me from a different country, from a family member who's living abroad. They impact energy and oil, which obviously impacts transportation, whether I can get to work. Impacts tourism, whether it's free, and open for people to come and spend in my country and help the government develop. They impact education and medicine, whether my mom can get the cancer saving treatment that she needs. Technology, whether we can build and develop our country to have sovereign and stable internet access, building materials, energy development, all of these things. It's really crippling to a country to have sanctions, and they do impact every single aspect of the life. But again, it is this kind of invisible thing that's happening. Yeah, and then the impact of sanctions, again, back just really quickly to Keegan's slide. Syria before 2011 was self-sufficient and had free healthcare for the people and had a strong pharmaceutical industry, and then had no foreign debt. And then after the sanctions were introduced, or the round of sanctions in 2011, inflation went from 4% to 188%. There was a food, medicine, and fuel shortage. Unemployment nearly doubled from 2010 to 2020. Massive electricity shortages. Cost of living skyrocketed from 2011 to 2024. fuck sanctions. Um, and yeah, I think that just to say that everything that's happening in Syria is happening with this in the background. And there have been anti sanctions campaigns for decades, and there have been solidarity campaigns for years trying to remove these sanctions. But you wouldn't know that by like watching mainstream media, and also even by some of the um, people who are in good faith who want the best for the people of Syria at the forefront of these conversations. People oftentimes forget to actually consider what decades of sanctions can do to a people, an infrastructure, cities, and an entire country.
So Luna just laid out essentially the U.S. and the European Union. You know, there were countries all over the world within the Western system that levied these types of sanctions against Syria um, as a way to destroy its economy and to affect the immiseration that we sort of talked about at the beginning of this presentation. The next way, the next tool the United States used was proxy war through you know, rebels, some so-called rebels, so-called revolutionaries by some, I would argue are proxy warriors predominantly. And this was explicitly ordered by the Obama administration to the CIA in an operation called Operation Timber Sycamore, which started in 2011 and which the Trump administration finally put an end to in, I believe, 2018. The context for this was that the NATO succeeded and the United States succeeded in completely destroying Libya in 2011. And there were enormous caches of weapons still left over from the Islamic extremist rebels that they funded there against the government of Muammar Gaddafi. The CIA, through third parties, through Gulf countries like Qatar and other Gulf monarchies, started to move all these weapons to sort of amassing Sunni supremacist Islamic extremist militant factions in the north of Syria in 2011. This was one of the most expensive in an organization like the CIA, which has a bunch of expensive, horrible operations. This was one of the most expensive ever. We don't know exactly because it's classified, but we know through, I think, leaks from Edward Snowden that at least this cost $1 billion of our taxpayer dollars per year to fund, train, and equip these militant factions. Next slide, please. And what's notable is that the United States knew who they were funding. You know, part of this became ISIS. Part of this, you know, was funding extremely sectarian motivated, very violent, very ideologically motivated people, some of whom had caused 9/11 in the United States a decade before. So in the top right of the screen, I can't point to it technically, but the paragraph in the top right is from a diplomatic cable that was released to us via WikiLeaks. So thank you, Julian Assange and company. And it's from a diplomatic cable from Damascus that's talking about the weaknesses of Bashar al-Assad's government. And the part I highlighted is one weakness is the potential threat to the regime from the increasing presence of transiting Islamist extremists. And the transiting portion is important. Some of these, and many of these, you know, people were Syrian, but a number of them were not, and it became a rallying point for these type of extremists around the globe to arrive and fight against the Syrian government. So this diplomatic cable is from 2006, acknowledging this is a weakness, which the U.S. later exploited through the CIA operation Timber Sycamore. The other piece, I just think is a really telling and sort of infamous email that Jake Sullivan, who is currently the national security advisor under in the Biden administration, sent to Hillary Clinton, who was then the Secretary of State. This email was sent in 2012, and he just point blank acknowledges that AQ, which stands for Al Qaeda, is on our side in Syria. So the United States knew that the insurgency that was funding, that through the CIA it was equipping and training, was dominated by Al Qaeda and other extremist organizations, and they didn't care. They used these organizations as a hammer against a government that they didn't want to exist. And this has precedent, um, in many other cases, notably in Afghanistan in the 70s against the fledgling socialist government that the USSR was attempting to support. And the United States poured money and weapons to support the Mujahideen, which gave rise to Al Qaeda. So I think it's really important to understand that the United States, although it claims to support democracy, human rights, etc., is willing to use whomever they can as a hammer against governments that do not support its interests. Um, all right, next slide, please. So we've talked about proxy war via predominantly extremist militant organizations. We've talked about sanctions to destroy the economy. And now we'll talk about the US occupation of Syria. So starting in 2014, the United States began to occupy an entire third of Syria's landmass. So using US military like troops on the ground, as well as in collaboration with local militia that we coordinated with and work with to this day. This occupation is ongoing, by the way. So the predominant the nominal reason that the U.S. gives for this is to quote unquote prevent ISIS from getting a stronghold in northeastern Syria. But many administration officials, as well as people who work in think tanks that write policy and legislation for our government, have acknowledged that the primary reason for this is to occupy the economic powerhouse of Syria, the wheat fields that allowed it to become self-sufficient in food, and the oil fields, which allowed it to have a decently functioning government with that could run in the black, that could run without debt. Since 2014, the Syrian government and the majority of the Syrian people have not had access to the revenue and to the development that can happen from access to these really powerful economic engines. They have been deliberately denied to them by a illegal military occupation led by the United States. There's not much more to say about that, but that is wild. And that, I think, is very, very not understood by most people in this country, that the United States has occupied that place for 10 years, a third of it for 10 years.
And then, so lastly, because we're talking about a lot of these proxy wars and soft power and sanctions and occupation, but there's also just brutal force. There's been 13 years of bombing, of the US bombing Syria. And again, to bring it back to Palestine, the place between Syria and Israel, called the Golan Heights, that Israel wants to continue to expand throughout. Israel wants to like expand and become like this huge, like bigger country than it already is. But in terms of Syria, it's trying to expand into the Golan Heights. And so it's expanding with violence and with militarization. Meanwhile, there's bombing from the US. So this is Syria being bombed in 2018. And this is being done through manufacturing consent. So in particular, there a lot of time, like in particular, I think just more broadly, it's important to understand and critique and just sit with things that are being said by the State Department and by like the State Department's media apparatus, including CNN and the New York Times, when they say that something is happening and it's like this horrendous thing, and they're using words like dictatorship and totalitarianism and authoritarianism, just like trying to understand what exactly they're trying to manufacture consent for. And when I say manufacturing consent, what they're trying to get the American public to be on board for what they're about to do. So the biggest example in Syria that I could think of was the chemical weapons attack. So the US concluded that Syria was using, Assad was using chemical weapons in 2019. I put in the resource list a report by Aaron Mate that goes into depth about whether or not this chemical attack actually happened. The purpose of Aaron Mate's report was really just to try to understand how much validity this claim had, and he found that there wasn't actually that much proof, and some of the proof was doctored, and there was like a lot of things that were being said that actually had no sources to them, and didn't cite like real sources, and a lot of it was like just Western think tanks repeating things over and over again. But the actual tangible proof, which is needed for an investigative report of that level, especially if you're about to do something crazy, just wasn't really there. Like there wasn't the proof, and the sightings, and the sources just weren't there. And we've seen this a lot. Like the most recent example is the Israeli government claiming that Hamas serial raped a whole bunch of women on October 7th. And that was used kind of as an excuse to just bomb Gaza. So the example in Syria was like this chemical attack that happened was used as an excuse to attack Syria and to bomb Syria, like this. And so it was like a huge deal, scandal. Assad is using chemical weapons. Meanwhile, there is proof. There is tangible proof by third-party investigators, by mainstream media outlets in Europe and in the United States that there are chemical weapons being used in Gaza. There's no outcry. There's no that no one's saying let's go bomb Israel because they're using chemical weapons against a population. So again, this is like this cycle of manufacturing consent. The other example of manufacturing consent is Jelani, who is this leader of the rebel leader that just did this like armed overturn of the Syrian government. This is in 2017, U.S. Embassy in Syria reminding people that he is on the terrorist list, and that he's part of Al-Qaeda, and that they're against Al-Qaeda, and that he is on the terrorist list. But just last week, or maybe it was even this week, he was on PBS, like doing media rounds. Like no one's arresting him. He's saying there is no torture, and they're kind of not even like asking a follow-up question. They're like, okay, whatever. And then this is, I think, from yesterday, Blinken acknowledging contact with the HTS rebels. And I think Keegan will go over like kind of that group. But essentially, the idea is that if the group is not really if a group or a movement or a people just are not used to U.S., the State Department, they will try everything they can do to stop them, to sanction them, to kill them, to jail them. But as soon as there's use for them, they'll just say, okay, that's fine. So again, we're seeing in real time right now how like the U.S. media apparatus is manufacturing consent for us to believe that the Syrian people were liberated by this person who just a couple years ago they were saying is on the terrorist list.
All right, so the group that Luna just mentioned, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, I apologize if I butchered that pronunciation, is the current name of the Al-Qaeda kind of affiliate in Syria. The original name, I believe, is like Al-Nusra Front or something. But the important point is that this organization has gone through a number of name changes, sort of organizational reshufflings. But al-Jilani, who is currently the leader and kind of the de facto leader right now of Syria, has been the leader the entire time. And he, in his past, was the deputy to the leader of ISIS. He was the leader of this Syrian affiliate of Al-Qaeda. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, given what Luna's talking about, this sort of like whitewashing and rebranding effort being put on by not only Western media, but also Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, and other outlets. What happened in early December is that So the Syrian civil war that the U.S. helped to stoke in 2011 had an uneasy kind of pause in 2018, in which the rebels led by HTS controlled the northern province, which is just north of Aleppo, of Idlib. They after, like, literally a day after the Israeli government signed a Hezbollah, I'm sorry, a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, these groups started advancing on Aleppo, and they met almost no opposition at all from the Syrian army. And so they just continued down this main highway between Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and all the way down to Damascus. And um, they took Damascus. They took the country. Bashar al-Assad left on December 8th. He was ushered out, I believe, with the support of Russia. And the Syrian state essentially collapsed in a couple weeks, where it had withstood, hybrid warfare from the United States, Israel, and NATO for 14 years. It was an enormous shock to people on all sides of this issue, and has extremely reverberating consequences throughout the region. I want to make a quick note about the Hezbollah ceasefire, which is that Hezbollah, as I mentioned earlier, which is a force of resistance against Zionism and Israeli aggression, which started because Israel occupied Lebanon from 1982 to 2000, was inside of Syria during the civil war, supporting on the side of the Syrian government, fighting ISIS, fighting HTS rebels, etc. And historically had been an important component of maintaining Syria's sovereignty, like maintaining the Syrian state. Hezbollah, were being not destroyed, excuse me, but really relentlessly attacked by Israel, and didn't really have the power to support the Syrian state this time. They sent a small force, reportedly, but it was not able to support. So the timing of the Hezbollah ceasefire and the advance of these forces is not a coincidence. According to Turkish intelligence, according to US intelligence, according to Ukrainian intelligence, according to Israeli intelligence, the list goes on. Next slide, please.
Okay. Just to note before that, Netanyahu immediately claimed credit for what happened to Assad. And then Biden also said that the failure of Russia and Iran and Hezbollah to defend the Syrian government was, quote, the direct result of the blows that Ukraine and Israel have delivered with the unflagging support of the US. So both of them are like ecstatic, and they're taking, accountability for what happened. Essentially, they're taking responsibility. And immediately Israel started launching airstrikes across the country that are being called, quote, the heaviest in the history of Syria. So as a result of this, and again, to bring it back to Palestine and why, we believe that the people in the Palestine Solidarity Movement need to have an anti-imperialist lens when it comes to Syria, is that what happened to Syria and the fall of Assad and the Syrian government, rather, also means that there was the fall of the last independent anti-Zionist Arab state and a main supporter of the Palestine axis of resistance. And it's a huge blow, and no one knows what's going to happen next, but most of the solidarity movement people and people who are aware of the conflict deeply, and the situation deeply, know that this is really a horrible thing to have happened to groups like resistance groups that are fighting on the land of occupied Palestine and are trying to ward off this like horrible genocide. Also, it was a victory for the U.S. and for Israeli aggression, and it was a destruction of Syrian sovereignty because, in a way, the U.S. won in this moment. The sanctions and the soft power and the bombing and the funding of groups and the radicalization of people and the intervention, it worked in this case, and they really got what they wanted.
Before I talk about the consequences, I just want to say one more thing about U.S. victory and Israeli victory, which is that Netanyahu specifically has targeted Syria along with a number of other countries for literally decades. In 1996, he was part of a document called the Clean Break document, which the United States identified that it needed to literally cleave the Middle East from its past in order to pave way for a new Middle East in which U.S. and Israeli interests could be supported. All right, sorry, I just wanted to mention that. And then to talk about the consequences of what happened, in the immediate aftermath of Damascus falling to the hands of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the other militant factions that fought against the Syrian state, literally within the same day, Israel advanced from the Golan Heights, which it already occupied illegally from Syria from 1967. It started to invade southern Syria, and by some reports is only 20 kilometers from Damascus. It has amassed a swath of land in southern Syria that is approximately equal to 3 times the Gaza Strip. And as Luna mentioned, it immediately started to launch enormous airstrikes. Israel claims to support Syrian sovereignty. The US claims to support Syrian sovereignty. Many people who are welcoming this claim to support Syrian sovereignty, but the first thing that Israel did is destroy Syria's military. They destroyed their air force, they destroyed their navy, and it's estimated that they destroyed about 70 to 80% of their military capacity. The ability to defend yourself is an inextricable part of sovereignty and the self-determination of people to be able to make their own choices without other people telling them what to do. You have to be able to defend yourself. The first thing that Israel targeted was that ability. So we know that when they say that they care about Syrian sovereignty, when Israel says that, when the United States says that, they don't. They also have destroyed a number of industrial targets to, again, prevent Syria from being self-sufficient and independent, from making its own things. So it has to be dependent on importing things from the West, and thus extremely vulnerable to political, diplomatic, and economic leverage from the West and Israel. Israel's annexation of land included the highest point in Syria, which is probably the most strategic point there, Mount Hermon, which overlooks Damascus. And they have already said, Israel has already said that they are not going to leave until at least the end of 2025. So that's kind of a roundup of the things that have happened from the US and the Israeli side. Internal to the country controlled by HTS, there has been, it's hard to know how much, but at least some sectarian violence. So what we mean is, again, a lot of the ideology of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other Islamist extremist organizations are that they don't accept other sects of Islam, and they also don't accept other religions at all. As Luna mentioned near the beginning of the presentation, Syria is an extremely diverse country with Christians, different sects of Islam, and other people living in relative harmony for like centuries and possibly thousands of years. There are videos that I won't go into the details of people, being killed in the streets because of their religion. There are, and the thing is, HTS and other organizations in the anti-state, militia coalition, when it controlled only Idlib, there were substantial corroborated instances of sectarian violence against Shia Muslims, against Druze, against Alawite people. And a lot of people are terrified to leave their houses in Syria because of the kind of violence that is happening on the streets in the countryside. Yeah, it's hard to know how widespread this is, but we know that some of these things have already happened. HTS has said that it is going to embrace the free market. So while Syria under Bashar al-Assad had already welcomed some kinds of neoliberalization in since 2000 in terms of allowing Western capital and Western money and investment to come into the country. There are still a number of state-owned and uh, assets, companies, etc., owned by the Syrian people. These are not Bashar al-Assad's, just like the military is not Bashar al-Assad's. This is the Syrian people's government. Um, and um, and HTS has said they're going to embrace a type of economic policy that's going to sell off all of these things. They have also, HTS has announced that it's kicking out the Palestinian factions. So as Luna mentioned, Damascus has been home, like a headquarters and not necessarily a home base, but a home away from home to important Palestinian resistance factions, from Hamas to Palestinian Islamic Jihad to the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. These are all factions currently involved in resistance to Zionism in either Gaza, the West Bank, or both. And they are being told, not asked, that they must disband and disband and disarm and leave their places that were, again, of relative safety in Syria, which is a huge blow to the Palestinian resistance faction. Certainly not lethal, but it's a big deal. It's an enormous consequence of this change. And then the last thing, and I know we've mentioned this a number of times, but a lot of this is to create a dependent Syria that is under the U.S. Western system that does not have self-determination or sovereignty. Next slide, please.
Okay, so yeah, just to finish up here, we've been hearing a lot about, this is a victory for the Syrian people. And I would argue, and I think Keegan would, that the victory is really that of the United States, Israel, and maybe Turkey as well, but definitely the U.S. Both parties are happy, and this is a victory for both of them. The state apparatus and the media. I don't know if everyone has seen this like very absurd and almost comical video of this person whose name I forgot. Please don't remind me. And then on the right, Netanyahu is met with some people this week, and he's very happy about this. It's definitely a victory for Israel. They have already captured land. And then lastly, it's a victory for the U.S. war machine. On the left, this is a bomb that was found inside a tunnel in Syria. Sometimes they find bombs that don't go off. So yeah, this is made, I think the final assembly location is in Pennsylvania. And then on the right, the Hellfire missile, also used across Gaza throughout the genocide. This was also had strikes in Syria. And yeah, this is made across the country and with subcontractors across the country, but the final assembly location is in Troy, Alabama. So yeah, this is another way for weapons companies to get more money and to be able to continue funding the war machine.
All right, we just threw a lot of information out there, and we're curious if anyone has questions, has comments, has critique, clarifications. Yeah, just trying to open up the space a little bit. Don't want to take too much more time from folks, but yeah, would love to hear what people's reactions are. People already knew all this, so I didn't have this presentation. Yeah, curious for some reaction. People are welcome to use the chat, welcome to come off mute. I know it's scary and again, a mostly faceless internet void, but I think we're all curious to hear what folks have to say. There are organizations like the Advocating Anti-War Coalition, Red Ant Collective, and among others, who are trying to start the work to end this. So if you're interested, please, yeah, please get in touch with people from those organizations, myself and Luna included. And yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add, Luna.
No, not really. But thank you all.
Thank you very
Really,
much. Good
yeah,
night.
really appreciate everybody's time. Take care, stay warm, happy holidays.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, take care, Alicia.
Bye.
Later, everybody.